Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 36, Chesney Wild. Charlie and I did not set off alone upon our expedition into Lincolnshire. My guardian had made up his mind not to lose sight of me until I was safe in Mr. Boythorn's house. So he accompanied us, and we were 2 days upon the road. I found every breath of air, and every scent, and every flower and leaf and blade of grass, and every passing cloud, and everything in nature more beautiful and wonderful to me than I had ever found it yet. This was my first gain from my illness. My guardian, intending to go back immediately, we appointed on our way down a day when my dear girl should come. I wrote her a letter, of which he took charge, and he left us within half an hour of our arrival at our destination on a delightful evening in the early summer. If a good fairy had built the house for me with a wave of her wand, and I had been a princess and her favorite godchild, I could not have been more considered in it. So many preparations were made for me, and such an endearing remembrance was shown of all my little tastes and likings, that I could have sat down, overcome a dozen times before I had revisited half the rooms. I did better than that, however, by showing them all to Charlie instead. Charlie's delight calmed mine, and after we had had a walk in the garden, I was as tranquilly happy as I ought to have been. It was a great comfort to me to be able to say to myself after tea, "Esther, my dear, I think you are quite sensible enough to sit down now and write a note of thanks to your host." He had left a note of welcome for me, as sunny as his own face, and had confided his bird to my care, which I knew to be his highest mark of confidence. Accordingly, I wrote a little note to him in London, telling him how all his favorite plants and trees were looking, and how the most astonishing of birds had chirped the honors of the house to me in the most hospitable manner, and how he was then at roost in the usual corner of his cage, but whether dreaming or no, I could not report. My note finished and sent off to the post, I made myself very busy unpacking and arranging, and I sent Charlie to bed in good time and told her I should want her no more that night, for I had not looked in the glass, and had never asked to have my own restored to me. I knew this to be a weakness which must be overcome, but I had always said to myself that I would begin afresh when I got to where I was now. Therefore, I had wanted to be alone, and therefore I said, now alone in my own room, "Esther, if you are to be happy, if you are to have any right to pray, to be true-hearted, and you must keep your word, my dear." I was quite resolved to keep it, but I sat down a little while first to reflect upon all my blessings, and then I said my prayers and thought a little more. My hair had not been cut off, though it had been in danger more than once. It was long and thick. I let it down and shook it out, and went up to the glass upon the dressing table. There was a little muslin curtain drawn across it. I drew it back and stood for a moment, looking through such a veil of my own hair that I could see nothing else. Then I put my hair aside and looked at the reflection in the mirror. I was very much changed, oh, very, very much. At first, my face was strange to me, but very soon it became more familiar, and then I knew the extent of the alteration in it better than I had done at first. It was not like what I had expected, but I had expected nothing definite. I had never been a beauty, and had never thought myself one, but I had been very different from this. It was all gone now. Heaven was so good to me that I could let it go with a few not bitter tears, and could stand there arranging my hair for the night quite thankfully. One thing troubled me. I considered it for a long time before I went to sleep. I had kept Mr. Woodcourt's flowers. When they were withered, I had dried them. I had put them in a book that I was fond of. Nobody knew this, not even Ada. I was doleful whether I had a right to preserve what he had sent to one so different, whether it was generous toward him to do so. At last I came to the conclusion that I might keep them, if I treasured them only as a remembrance of what was irrevocably past and gone, never to be looked back on any more. I hope this may not seem trivial. I was very much in earnest. I took care to be up early in the morning, and to be up before the glass when Charlie came in on tiptoe. "Dear, dear miss," cried Charlie, starting, "is that you?" "Yes, Charlie," I said, quietly putting up my hair, "and I am very well indeed, and very happy." I saw it was a weight off Charlie's mind, but it was a greater weight off mine. I knew the worst now, and was composed to it. I shall not conceal as I go on the weakness I could not quite conquer. But they always passed from me soon, and the happier frame of mind stayed by me faithfully, wishing to be fully re-established in my strength and my good spirits before Ada came. I laid down the little series of plans with Charlie for being in the fresh air all day long. We were to be out before breakfast, and were to dine early, and were to be out again before and after dinner, and were to walk in the garden after tea, and were to go to rest bedtimes, and were to climb every hill and explore every road lane and field in the neighborhood. As to restoratives and strengthening delicacies, Mr. Boythorn's good housekeeper was forever trotting about with something to eat or drink in her hand. Then there was a pony expressly for my riding, a chubby pony with a short neck and a mane over his eyes, who could canter when he would so easily and quietly that he was a treasure. It was in a very few days he would come to me in the paddock when I called him, and eat out of my hand and follow me about. Stubbs. We drove him triumphantly through the green lanes and to the village. Charlie and I had reason to call it the most friendly of villages, I am sure, for in a week's time the people were so glad to see us go by, though ever so frequently in the course of a day, that there were faces of greeting in every cottage. I had known many of the grown people before, and almost all the children, but now the very steeple began to wear a familiar and affectionate look. Thus, what with being so much in the air, playing with so many children, gossiping with so many people, sitting on invitation, and in many cottages, going on with Charlie's education, and writing long letters to Ada every day, I had scarcely time to think about that little loss of mine, and was almost always cheerful. If I did think of it at odd moments now and then, I had only to be busy and forget it. There was a favorite spot of mine in the park woods of Chesney Wold, where a seat had been erected commanding a lovely view. The wood had been cleared and opened to improve this point of sight, and the bright sunny landscape beyond was so beautiful that I rested there at least once every day. A picturesque part of the hall, called the Ghost's Walk, was seen to advantage from this higher ground, and the startling name and the old legend in the Dedlock family, which I had heard from Mr. Boythorn accounting for it, mingled with the view and gave it something of a mysterious interest in addition to its real charms. It would be idle to inquire now why I never went close to the house or never went inside it. The family was not there. I had heard on my arrival and were not expected. I was far from being incurious and uninterested about the building. On the contrary, I often sat in this place wondering how the rooms ranged, and whether any echo like a footstep really did resound at times, as the story said, upon the lonely Ghost's Walk. The indefinable feelings with which Lady Dedlock had impressed me may have had some influence in keeping me from the house, even when she was absent. I am not sure. Her face and figure were associated with it naturally, but I cannot say that they repelled me from it, though something did. For whatever reason or no reason, I had never once gone near it, down to the day at which my story now arrives. I was resting at my favorite point after a long ramble, and Charlie was gathering violets at a little distance from me. I had been looking at the Ghost's Walk, lying in a deep shade of masonry afar off, and picturing myself the female shape that was said to haunt it, when I became aware of a figure approaching through the wood. The perspective was so long and so darkened by leaves that at first I could not discern what figure it was, but little by little it revealed itself to be a woman's, a lady's, Lady Dedlock's. She was alone and coming to where I sat. With a much quicker step, I observed to my surprise than was usual with her. I was flustered by her being unexpectedly so near. She was almost within speaking distance before I knew her, and would have risen to continue my walk, but I could not. I was rendered motionless, not so much by her hurried gesture and entreaty, not so much by her quick advance and outstretched hands, not so much by the great change in her manner and the absence of her haughty self-restraint, as by something in her face that I had pined for and dreamed of when I was a little child, something I had never seen in any face, something I had never seen in hers before. A dread and faintness fell upon me, and I called to Charlie. Lady Dedlock stopped upon the interest, and changed back almost to what I had known her. "Miss Summerson, I am afraid I have startled you," she said, now advancing slowly. You can scarcely be strong yet. You have been very ill, I know. I have been much concerned to hear it." I could no more have removed my eyes from her pale face than I could have stirred from the bench on which I sat. She gave me her hand, and its deadly coldness, so at variance with the enforced composure of her features, deepened the fascination that overpowered me. I cannot say what was in my whirling thoughts. "You are recovering again?" she asked kindly. I was quite well but a moment ago, Lady Dedlock." "Is this your young attendant?" "Yes." "Will you send her on before and walk toward your house with me?" "Charlie," said I, "take your flowers home. I will follow you directly." Charlie, with her best curtsy, blushingly tied on her bonnet and went her way. When she was gone, Lady Dedlock sat down on the seat beside me. I cannot tell in any words what the state of her mind was when I saw in her hand my handkerchief with which I had covered the dead baby. I looked at her, but I could not see her. I could not hear her. I could not draw my breath. The beating of my heart was so violent and wild that I felt as if my life were breaking from me. But when she caught me to her breast, kissed me, wept over me, compassionated me, and called me back to myself, when she fell down on her knees and cried to me, "Oh, my child, I am your wicked and unhappy mother. Try to forgive me." When I saw her at my feet on the bare earth, in her great agony of mind, I felt, through all my tumult of emotion, a burst of gratitude to the providence of God, that I was so changed that I could never disgrace her by any trace of likeness, that nobody could even now look at me and look at her and remotely think of any near tie between us. I raised my mother up, praying and beseeching her not to stoop before me in such affliction and humiliation. I did so in broken, incoherent words, for, besides the trouble I was in, it frightened me to see her at my feet. I told her so, or I tried to tell her, that if it were for me, her child, under any circumstances, to take upon me to forgive her, I did it, and had done it many, many years. I told her that my heart overflowed with love for her, that it was natural love, which nothing in the past had changed or could change, that it was not for me to take into account her having given me life, but that my duty was to bless her and receive her, though the whole world turned from her, and that I only asked her leave to do it. I held my mother in my embrace, and she held me in hers, and among the still woods, in the silence of the summer day, there seemed to be nothing but our own two troubled minds that was not at peace. "To bless and receive me," groaned my mother. "It is far too late. I must travel my dark road alone, and it will lead me where it will, from day to day, sometimes from hour to hour. I do not see the way before my guilty feet. This is the earthly punishment I have brought upon myself. I bear it, and I hide it. I must keep this secret, if by any means it can be kept, not wholly for myself. I have a husband, wretched and dishonoring creature that I am." These words she uttered with a suppressed cry of despair, more terrible in its sound than any shriek. Covering her face with her hands, she shrank down in my embrace, as if she were unwilling that I should touch her, nor could I, by my utmost persuasions, or by any endearments I could use, prevail upon her to rise. She said, "No, no, no. She could only speak to me so. She must be proud and disdainful everywhere else. She would be humbled and ashamed there, in the only natural moments of her life. My unhappy mother told me that in my illness she had been nearly frantic. She had but then known that her child was living. She could not have suspected me to be that child before. She had followed me down here to speak to me but once in all her life. We could never associate, never could communicate, never probably from that time forth could interchange another word. She put into my hands a letter she had written for my reading, only, and she said, when I had read it and destroyed it, but not so much for her sake, since she asked nothing, as for her husband's and my own. I must evermore consider her as dead. If I could believe that she loved me in this agony in which I saw her, with a mother's love, she asked me to do that, for then I might think of her with a greater pity, imagining what she suffered. She had put herself beyond all hope and beyond all help. Whether she preserved her secret until death, or it came to be discovered and she brought dishonor and disgrace upon the name she had taken, it was her solitary struggle always, and no affection could come near her, and no human creature could render her any aid. "But is the secret safe so far?" I asked. "Is it safe now, dearest mother?" "No," replied my mother. "It has been very near discovery. It was saved by an accident. It may be lost by another accident tomorrow, any day. Do you dread a particular person?" "I dread one person very much. An enemy? Not a friend. One who is too passionless to be either. He is Sir Leicester Dedlock's lawyer, mechanically faithful without attachment, and very jealous of the profit, privilege, and reputation of being master of the mysteries of great houses. Has he any suspicions?" "Many." "Not of you?" "Yes. He is always vigilant, and always near me. I may keep him at a standstill, but I can never shake him off." "Has he so little pity or compassion? Has he so little pity or compunction?" "He has none, and no anger. He is indifferent to everything but his calling. His calling is the acquisition of secrets, and the holding possession of such power as they give him. Could you trust in him?" "I shall never try. The dark road I have trodden for so many years will end where it will. I follow it alone to the end, whatever the end may be. It may be near, it may be distant. While the road lasts, nothing turns me." "Dear mother, are you so resolved?" "I am resolved. I have long outbidden folly with folly, pride with pride, scorn with scorn, insolence with insolence, and have outlived many vanities with many more. I will outlive this danger and outdie it if I can. It has closed around me almost as awfully as if these woods of Chesney Wild had closed around the house, but my course through it is the same. I have but one. I can have but one." "Mr. Jarndyce," I was beginning, when my mother hurriedly inquired, "Does he suspect?" "No," said I. "No, indeed. Be assured he does not." And I told her what he had related to me as his knowledge of my story. "But he is so good and sensible," said I, "that perhaps if he knew—" My mother, who until this time had made no change in her position, raised her hands to my lips and stopped me. "Confide fully in him," she said after a little while. "You have my free consent, a small gift from such a mother, to her injured child, but do not tell me of it. Some pride is left in me even yet." I explained, or tried to do it, how I only hoped that Mr. Jarndyce, who had been the best of fathers to me, might be able to afford some counsel and support to her, but my mother answered no, it was impossible. No one could help her through the desert that lay before her. She must go alone. My child," she said, "for the last time, these kisses for the last time, these arms upon my neck for the last time. We shall meet no more. I hope to do what I seek to do. I must be what I have been. So long. Such is my reward and doom. If you hear Lady Dedlock, brilliant, prosperous, and flattered, think of your wretched mother, conscience-stricken underneath that mask. Think that the reality is in her suffering, in her useless remorse, in her murdering within her breast the only love and truth of which it is capable, and then forgive her if you can, and cry to heaven to forgive her, which it never can." We held one another for a little space yet, but she was so firm that she took my hands away and put them back against my breast, and with a last kiss she held them there, released them, and went from me into the wood. I was alone, calm and quiet below me. The sun and shade lay Calm and quiet below me, in the sun and shade, lay the old house, with its terraces and turrets on which there seemed to me to be such complete repose when I first saw it, but which now looked like the obdurate and unpitying watcher of my mother's misery. Stunned as I was, as weak and helpless at first as I had ever been in my sick chamber, the necessity of guarding against the danger of discovery, or even of the remotest suspicion, did me service. I took such precautions as I could to hide from Charlie that I had been crying, and I constrained myself to think of every sacred obligation that there was upon me to be careful and collected. After an hour or so I was better, and felt that I might return. I went home very slowly and told Charlie, whom I found at the gate looking at me, that I had been tempted to extend my walk after Lady Dedlock had left me, and that I was overtired and would lie down. Safe in my own room, I read the letter. I clearly derived from it, and that was much, then, that I had not been abandoned by my mother, her elder and only sister, the godmother of my childhood, discovering signs of life in me when I had been laid aside as dead, had, in her stern sense of duty, with no desire or willingness that I should live, reared me in rigid secretly, and never again beheld my mother's face from within a few hours of my birth. So strangely did I hold my place in this world, that until within a short time back I had never, in my own mother's knowledge, breathed, had been buried, had never been endowed with life, had never borne a name. When she had first seen me in the church, she had been startled, and thought of what I would have been, and had thought of what would have been like me if it had ever lived and had lived on, but that was all then. What more the letter told me needs not be repeated here. It has its own time and places in my story. It has its own times and places in my story. My first care was to burn what my mother had written. I hope it may not appear very unnatural or bad in me, that I then became heavily sorrowful to think I had ever been reared, that I felt as if I knew it would have been better and happier for many people if indeed I had never breathed, that I had a terror of myself, as the danger and the possible disgrace of my own mother, and of a proud family name, that I was so confused and shaken as to be possessed by a belief that it was right and had been intended that I should die at my birth, and that it was wrong and not intended that I should be then alive. These are the real feelings that I had. I fell asleep, worn out, and when awake, I cried afresh to think that I was back in the world, with my load of troubles for others. I was more than ever frightened of myself, thinking anew of her, against whom I was a witness, of the owner of Chesney Wold. The day waned into a gloomy evening, overcast and sad, and I still contended with the same distress. I went out alone, and after walking a little in the park, watching the dark shades falling on the trees and the fitful flight of the bats, which sometimes almost touched me, was attracted to the house for the first time. Perhaps I might not have gone near if I had been in a stronger frame of mind. As it was, I took the path that led close by it. I did not dare linger or to look up, but I passed before the terrace garden with its fragrant odors and its broad walks and its well-kept beds and smooth turf, and I saw how beautiful and grave it was, and how the old stone balustrades and parapets and wide flights of shallow steps were seamed by time and weather, and how the trained moss and ivy grew about them and around the old stone pedestal of the sundial, and I heard the fountain falling. Then the way went by long lines of dark windows, diversified by turreted towers and porches of eccentric shapes. Thence the path wound underneath a gateway and through a courtyard where the principal entrance was. So, encountering presently a sweet smell of limes, I turned with the turning of the path to the south front, and there, above me, were the balustrades of the Ghost's Walk, and one lighted window that might be my mother's. The way was paved here, like the terrace overhead, and my footsteps, from being noiseless, made an echoing sound upon the flags. Stopping to look at nothing, but seeing all I did see as I went, I was passing quickly on, and in a few moments should have passed the lighted window, when my echoing footsteps brought it suddenly into my mind that there was a dreadful truth in the legend of the Ghost's Walk, that it was I who was to bring calamity upon the stately house, that my warning feet were haunting it even then. Seized with an augmented terror of myself, which turned me cold, I ran from myself, and never paused until I had gained the lodge gate, and the park lay sullen and black behind me. Not before I was alone in my own room for the night, and had again been dejected and unhappy there, did I begin to know how wrong and thankless this state was. But from my darling, who was coming on the morrow, I found a joyful letter full of such loving anticipation that I must have been made of marble if it had not moved me. From my guardian I found another letter, asking me to tell Dame Durden, if I should see that little woman anywhere, that they had moped most pitiably without her, that the housekeeping was going to rack and ruin, that nobody else could manage the keys, and that everybody in and about the house declared it was not the some house, and was becoming rebellious for her return. 2 such letters together made me think how far beyond my deserts I was beloved, and how happy I ought to be. That made me think of all my past life, and brought me, as it ought to have done before, into a better condition. For I saw very well that I could not have been intended to die, or I should never have lived. Not to say I should never have been reserved for such a happy life. I saw very well how many things had worked together for my welfare, and that if the sins of the fathers were sometimes visited upon the children, the phrase did not mean what I had in the morning feared it meant. I knew I was an innocent of my birth as a queen of hers, and that before my heavenly Father I should not be punished for birth, nor a queen rewarded for it. I had had experience in the shock of that very day, that I could, even thus soon, find comforting reconcilements in the change that had fallen on me. I renewed my resolutions, and prayed to be strengthened in them, pouring out my heart for myself and for my unhappy mother, and feeling that the darkness of the morning was passing away. It was not upon my sleep, and when the next day's light woke me, it was gone. My lovely girl was to arrive at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. How to help myself through the intermediate time better than by taking a long walk along the road by which she was to come, I did not know, so Charlie and I and Stubbs made a long expedition along the road and back. On our return, we had a great review of the house and the garden, and saw that everything was in its prettiest condition, and had the bird out ready for an important part of the establishment. There were more than 2 full hours yet to elapse before she could come, and in that interval, which seemed a long one, I must confess I was nervously anxious about my altered looks. I loved my darlings so well that I was more concerned for their effect on her than on anyone. I was not in this slight distress because I was all repined, but I thought, would she be wholly prepared? When she first saw me, might she not be a little shocked and disappointed? Might it not prove a little worse than she expected? I knew the various expressions of my sweet girl's face so well, and it was such an honest face in its loveliness that I was sure beforehand she could not hide that first look at me. And I considered whether, if I should signify any one of these meanings, which was so very likely, could I quote myself for myself. Well, I thought I could. I'm going to back up a minute. And I considered whether, if I should signify any of these meetings, which was quite likely, could I quite answer for myself. I thought I could. After last night, I thought I could. At last, when I believed there was at least a quarter of an hour more yet, Charlie all at once cried out to me as I was trembling in the garden, "Here she comes, miss! Here she comes!" I did not mean to do it, but I ran upstairs into my room and hid myself behind the door. There I stood, trembling, even when I heard my darling calling as she came upstairs. "Esther, my dear love, where are you, little woman? Dear Dame Durden." She ran in and was running out again when she saw me. Ah, my angel girl, the old dear look of love, all fondness, all affection, nothing else in it. No, nothing, nothing. Oh, how happy I was, down upon the floor with my sweet, beautiful girl down upon the floor too, holding my scarred face in her lovely cheek, bathing it with tears and kisses, rocking me to and fro like a child, calling me by every tender name she could think of, and pressing me to her faithful heart. And that is the end of chapter 36.